Well, good afternoon. Thank you for having me back. I'm going to talk about a subject that I guess most of you have heard about, and some of you may know some details, but it's one of those stories that nobody knows all the little bits and pieces that go to make up the tragedy of the USS Indianapolis. The sinking of any ship is a tragedy in itself. The loss of the ship, the loss of the crew, whatever. But in the case of the USS Indianapolis, this has been described as a tragedy of epic proportions. Not just for the ship, but for quite a few people. On the 6th of November 1968, the police in Litchfield, Connecticut in the USA were called to a report of the body of a man lying on the steps of a house. When they arrived, they indeed found the body of a man with a single gunshot wound to the head that had killed him. The gardener who had reported this told the police that the man had been very despondent, very depressed, particularly over the last year or so since the loss of his wife. But he also pointed out that this man had received a constant stream of hate mail and vitriolic phone calls for more than 20 years. The man was Charles Butler McVeigh. He was a captain in the US Navy. He graduated, well, he was born in 1898 into a Navy family. His father was a senior naval officer. In later years, his father, in fact, was the Commander-in-Chief of the US Asiatic Fleet. McVeigh entered the Naval Academy and graduated top of his class in 1920. He had a distinguished career. He rose through the ranks. He served in every theatre, including 2 assignments to the Office of Naval Intelligence. Now that might sound like nothing, but to be assigned to the Office of Naval Intelligence, you have to have a very deep insight into the machinations of not only the US Navy, but every Navy that they would likely to come up against as an enemy. He served in all theatres, as I said, and in 1943 he was assigned as the executive officer of the cruiser USS Cleveland. The Cleveland saw extensive action in the Pacific, and McVeigh was awarded the Silver Star for his for conspicuous gallantry during his service on the Cleveland. In November 1944, he was promoted to captain and assigned to command the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis, the flagship of the 5th Fleet. The Indianapolis was known as the Lucky Ship. Initially, she commissioned in 1932, a 10,000-ton cruiser, very big ship for the time, and initially was painted white because she was chosen as the personal conveyance of Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt, the president, did not like to fly. He also suffered from polio, and he needed quite a bit of room. And the Indianapolis had been fitted out with a flag facility designed to accommodate another 20 or so other officers. So he used the Indianapolis as his basically private yacht, and whenever he had to travel overseas, he travelled on the Indianapolis. So it was a feather in the cap to see the Indianapolis in its basic form, very heavily armed. As I say, 10,000-ton ship. Not very big these days, but certainly back in those days it was. She carried 9 8-inch guns, heavy caliber guns. She carried 8 5-inch guns, 16 40mm guns, and 40 20mm guns. She also carried 3 float planes. very formidable ship. Only two of these were built, the other being the USS Portland. And the Indianapolis served in all theatres under McVeigh's command. She served in the Pacific, in the Aleutian Islands up off Alaska, and participated in the Americans' island hopping campaign in the Pacific campaign. And on 31st of March 1945, off Okinawa, she was struck by 3 kamikaze aircraft, which caused a significant amount of damage. McVeigh took the ship back to the base at Pearl Harbor, but was told that the shipyard there was full. He would have to take it to San Diego for repairs. But again, San Diego was also full, not only with repairs, but building thousands of landing craft for the anticipated invasion of Japan. So the Indianapolis was then redirected to go to the Mare Island Navy Yard in San Francisco. The Mare Island Navy Yard, however, was in the domain of the American Navy's 7th Fleet. So they had to transfer the ship from the 5th Fleet to the 7th Fleet, which they did do. But because it was only for repairs, it was what they called a paper transfer. It just was basically moving the Indianapolis file from one drawer to another. While they were at Mare Island, a number of engineers came and toured the ship, and in the dead of night, several trucks pulled up on the wharf and some large boxes were welded onto the deck of the Indianapolis. No one knew what was in the boxes, no one knew who these people were. Even McVeigh was kept in the dark. But he was then told to sail for Tinian, an island in the Marianas in the Central Pacific. So off he went. He had an escort all the way and arrived at Tinian, where engineers came on board and removed these large boxes. What McVeigh and his crew did not know was that they had just transported the atom bombs that were going to be dropped on Japan. The B-29s that carried the bombs were based at Saipan. It's only a small island, but it was a strategic position in the Pacific that caused the Americans to use it. McVeigh was then told to proceed to the Philippines, where he would rejoin his task force. So off they went. But he requested an escort, saying, "We're going into these open waters alone." But he was told there are no submarines in the area. You're not going to get an escort. You can zigzag at your own discretion during daylight hours. Now, zigzagging, for those of you that don't know, is a continuing alteration of course, but it is of limited value. In actual fact, it assists the submarines in calculating ranges, so zigzagging is really not a good tactic. But McVeigh, being a good Navy man, zigzagged through the day and straightened it out during the night. But what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that a Japanese submarine called the I-58 had just come back from the South Pacific and was heading home to Japan under the command of a fellow called Mokitsura Hashimoto. Hashimoto had had a successful patrol and he only had 2 torpedoes left in the submarine. And at 11:30 p.m. on the 31st of July 1945, he spotted the Indianapolis. He identified it as a USS New Mexico, a battleship, but there you go, middle of the night, you see a big ship, pick the biggest one you can. What no one else knew was the fact that the Indianapolis was now straightened out. He didn't zigzag. McVeigh did not zigzag. Even the crew thought they were still zigzagging, but they were heading on a straight course. Hashimoto fired his 2 torpedoes, and both of them struck the Indianapolis. One struck it in the middle, right in the midships, which totally destroyed his power units. So the ship lost all power. The second blew the bow off, so the ship couldn't go anywhere. It began to sink. McVeigh ordered abandon ship, but he had no power, so he couldn't make any broadcasts. He detailed several sailors to run the length of the ship, ordering abandon ship. But the Indianapolis sank in just under 11 minutes. On board, she had a crew of 1,206, of whom it is considered around 300 died in the initial impact of the torpedoes. When the Indianapolis sank, nobody knew where it was. The 5th Fleet thought it was with the 7th Fleet. The 7th Fleet thought it was still with the 5th Fleet. So the Indianapolis had disappeared from the books. No one knew where the ship was. 3 days later, a Ventura scout plane was flying over the area. The pilot was having trouble with his radio, so he began to circle to try and pick up the base in the Philippines, and in so doing one of the crewmen spotted an oil slick in the water, so they decided to go down and have a look. And to their horror, they saw hundreds of men in the water floating in this oil slick. They radioed in, and a Catalina was left the Philippines to fly to the area. The Ventura dropped a couple of life rafts, some rations and some water, but they couldn't stay on station. The Catalina arrived on station and dropped life rafts, but the pilot saw crew members being attacked by sharks. Quite a few sharks, to be honest with you. They were actually swimming straight into the groups of men and just taking them at will. So, against all orders, the Catalina pilot decided to land. He knew he'd never take off again. He put the plane down, and the men in the water started to make their way towards the plane, and within a few minutes he had 56 of the men lying up on the wings, but he couldn't get them all on board. In one of the rafts was a young ensign, a young junior officer, and he decided, I can swim to the Catalina, and he leapt into the water and started swimming. But those couple of days without food, without water, out in the elements, had taken its toll. And he found that his life jacket was holding him back, so he took the life jacket off and drowned. Now that man played a significant part in later proceedings, this young officer who drowned. The Catalina pilot had radioed in the plight of these men in the water, and within 6 hours, an escort ship called the USS Cecil J. Doyle, or as the Americans say, Cecil J. Doyle, arrived on the scene. And over the next few hours, another half a dozen or so ships arrived, started pulling people out of the water. The commanding officer of the Doyle was a fellow called Graham Claytor. Graham Claytor, in his civilian life, was an attorney. In the American military, they have what they call their Reserve Officer Training Corps, and he was a member of the Naval Reserve Officer Training Corps. So when hostilities commenced, he was called up, and he commanded the Doyle. After the war, Claytor went back to his business as an attorney. He was very well regarded, highly respected, and in fact he served as the Secretary of the Navy under President Jimmy Carter. On the 3rd of August, they managed to get some of the men on board, but being a small ship, they couldn't take that many, and unfortunately they were witnessing men still being attacked and killed by sharks. Survivors that were brought on board were given basic medical attention because being a small ship, they didn't carry too much in the way of medical facilities. But as the bigger ships arrived, they took the men on board and took them back to Guam, where they were treated. Of the 1,200 crew, as I say, about 300 were lost in the initial sinking, but only 316 men were rescued. The rest had drowned, died of wounds, or been taken by sharks. And it's considered to be the single biggest shark attack in the world. For 3 days, these guys were being attacked by schools of sharks. McVeigh survived, but as is always the way, his boss had a word to say. Admiral Nimitz, commander of the 7th Fleet, issued a letter of reprimand. Now, this is really nothing in the sense of the word. It's just saying, you lost your ship, you naughty boy. But McVeigh was to become the only naval officer ever to be court-martialed for losing his ship in an act of war. The Chief of the Navy was a fellow called Admiral Ernest J. King. King moved in high social circles, and one of his friends was a fellow called William Donaldson, who was a prominent New York businessman who happened to be the father of that young ensign that drowned. And he pressured King to do something about it. So King overturned Nimitz's decision, withdrew the letter of reprimand and ordered a court-martial. He was charged with failing to zigzag and a failure to order an abandoned ship. To McVeigh's horror, I guess, the prime witness for the prosecution was the commander of the Japanese submarine. The American Navy actually flew an enemy officer, or former enemy officer, back to the United States to present his case against McVeigh. Hashimoto did say that zigzagging was a technique of questionable value. And there were plenty of witnesses to say that McVeigh had ordered sailors to traverse the ship, ordering abandoned ship. But King persisted and charged him only with failure to zigzag. In his defence, McVeigh pointed out that he was told to zigzag at his own discretion through the night. He, at his own discretion, did not zigzag during the night, and that's what he was charged with. One of the things that comes to light within any naval investigation is the responsibility of command. In each ship, there is only one man who, in the hour of emergency, of peril at sea, can turn to no other man. There is one who alone is ultimately responsible for the safe navigation, engineering performance, accurate gunfire, and morale of his ship. He is the commanding officer. He is the ship. This is what King pointed out at the court-martial, that McVeigh alone was responsible for this. In Indianapolis in Indiana, the ship's namesake city, there is a memorial to McVeigh that was erected by the City Council of Indianapolis. But the story didn't end there. In 1996, a young high school student in America by the name of Hunter Scott was given an assignment to write an essay on a military history subject, and he chose the sinking of the USS Indianapolis. And in his research, he revealed that King had ulterior motives apart from his relationship with Donaldson. When King was a young officer, he was serving on a ship on the Asiatic station, and he was caught trying to bring a woman on board one night and was reprimanded by the duty officer, who subsequently added a a charge sheet to his file, and King was overlooked for promotion on several occasions because of this. The officer who charged him was McVeigh's father. So King wanted to get back at him. President Clinton was handed the essay by a congressman, and he ordered an investigation. And as a result, McVeigh was exonerated. A little bit late, but all charges were dropped and his record was cleaned. Since World War II, there have been 2 US Navy vessels named Indianapolis. One was a nuclear submarine that decommissioned in 1998. The other is what's called a littoral combat ship that is still in service. They carried, well, they still carry on the littoral combat ship, Clinton's exoneration of McVeigh. And entered into the Uniform Code of Military Justice was an article to say that no one can be brought up on charges because of personal vindictiveness, which this was. McVeigh never got anything. He had 2 sons. They fought to clear his name. They are both now gone. But Hunter Scott, the young man who wrote the essay, was awarded a Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Clinton, which goes to show just how serious the government took this terrible miscarriage of justice. The loss of the Indianapolis, as I said, is a tragedy of epic proportions, not only for those taken by the sharks or killed in the attack, but by McVeigh and his family, who suffered all those years with these hate mail from loved ones who'd been killed on the Indianapolis, and who blamed McVeigh for their loss. And yet it was Admiral King who was the one who was at fault. The tragedy of the Indianapolis, as I say, a tragedy of epic proportions. King resigned from the Navy in the early 50s because of his position as fleet commander. They named a cruiser for him. But King was never regarded by his contemporaries as a decent sort of person. He was known for a terrible temper and, as I say, his vindictiveness. That is one part of the tragedy, is the fact that someone somewhere is responsible for this. When the ship left Mare Island, her file should have gone back to the 7th Fleet, but it didn't. The 5th Fleet basically, or they should have gone back to the 5th Fleet. The 7th Fleet said, well, she's no longer with us. Because of wartime security, you can't have the time of departure of a warship, and therefore you can't have a time of arrival. So it was never missed. Clerical error. Yes, sir. Oh yes, it's been found. It's in 13,800 feet of water. It's in 5 pieces because it broke up on the way down. They'll never pull it up. They'll never. It's one of those. The American Navy have an ongoing program to try and find lost ships, and over the last 30 years or so, they've found about 140. They've still got a few to go, but they've got a dedicated team to look for these ships. Well, thank you for your time, folks.